I'm going to be doing something a little bit special today for Sonic Academy. We're going to be taking a song that I didn't write, somebody else wrote, but I really like, and we're going to be breaking it down full from top to bottom, analyzing all the parts. The song we've chosen is a song called Musica by Meduza, and it's a very fascinating tech house song. It came out around the end of 2023. Since then, they've had a lot of great releases on their label, Eternal Records. They've done releases on other labels as well. And their sound kind of hits this border between tech house and progressive house. The song Musica tends to be a little bit more on the tech house side of things. It's a very driving tech house banger kind of a song, but it's a very interesting song in that there are not a lot of elements. There are very few elements. They're very repetitive. The MIDI parts are very simple, but it's all how the elements are used, how the song is arranged, and the automation and the modification of the sounds that keeps the arrangement really interesting. So this song piqued our ears here at Sonic Academy, and we wanted to do a full breakdown, so I sat down and spent some time analyzing it. We'll begin by going through the reference song, picking apart the different sounds and the different sections of the arrangement. I'll go through how I recreated each of the different sounds. We'll be using Anna 2 for this, but you can actually follow along in any subtractive synthesizer. Most of these sounds are fairly simple to recreate. All of the audio files will be using the samples, the Anna 2 presets, as well as the vocal samples will all be included in the download file for this course, so you'll be able to grab those and use those with whatever synthesizer you want in whatever DAW you want. I'll be using Ableton Live for this, and yeah, we'll kind of see how it's all put together, how the sausage is made, so to speak. And after creating all the sounds, we'll look at how we can utilize automation with macro variations. And at the end of the course, of course, we'll do a final mix down and a little rough mastering to get it nice and loud and competitive to other songs in the genre. So stick with me as we break down and recreate the song Musica by Meduza. So let's go ahead and load Anna 2 on a new MIDI track. I like to color my bass tracks blue for bass. Rename this bass, and we will load Anna 2. And for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to load the Anna 2 presets, but I'll talk through what I've done to create them. And none of the sounds in this song are particularly super difficult, and you could really recreate them with pretty much any subtractive synthesizer and a couple effects. But we'll load in what I've built in Anna 2, and like I said, I'll talk you through. So we're going to go into the assets folder. There it is, Anna 2 presets, and then the Bass Tech Musica preset. So let's go ahead and load that. And let's also throw our MIDI in so we have something to kind of listen to as we're talking through this preset. So I've got my assets folder down here, right? And we'll go to not samples, we'll go to MIDI, and then bass main. We'll just throw that in on the drop so we can hear what that sounds like. And I'll just extend it. This clip should be set up to loop. Yes, it is. And then this is just going to loop through the entire drop. So before we look at the preset, let's just look at the MIDI notes really quickly, and you can obviously, dive into this a little deeper on your end. I'm going to hit the fold button here, but the track is, I think, in the key of A minor, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong on that. I have to double check that. But the bass line kind of centers around A, and then it jumps up to G at the end of basically every 2 beats. It's a pretty repetitive bass line. Change my grid here. I used 16th notes. You can kind of see what I've done here. Let's maybe zoom a little bit. Now, velocity is going to be important. So you'll notice in the MIDI clip there are some different velocities here. That's going to be affecting, I think, volume and maybe filter cutoff, if I remember correctly. So yeah, this is the bass. And then the thing about this bass is it's the same bass preset throughout the whole song, but there's lots and lots of automation, and there's lots of things moving, and we'll get into that. We're going to have to do a separate video on that. So for this video, we're just going to talk about what's going on in the bass patch to create that core sound. So let's break it open. So if we click on the oscillator mix tab here in the display, we can see that both oscillators 1 and 2 are playing right now. You can see oscillator 1 is just maxed out full volume. Oscillator 2 is a little bit lower, about -7.5 decibels, somewhere around there. And let's see what's going on here. So oscillator 1 has this saw fat waveform. So if I click there, I can change different saw waveforms. And if you have Anna 2, feel free to jump around and try some different saw waves and see how all their tones just vary very slightly, and see if you like a certain tone better or whatever. But I chose saw fat for that one. And then for oscillator 2, I'm using this Square 101, which I think is sampled from a Roland SH101. And the combination of those two together just sounded really nice. Now, both of them are pitched at the octave -2. And then I've also used the fine tuning control. I've just gone up by 6 cents on the saw wave and then down to -6 cents on the square wave. So that slight detuning is going to give it more of an analog character, as well as the drift. I've cranked the drift parameter up to 100% on both oscillators. I did a whole video on that. If you are subscribed to Sonic Academy, you can look that up. I talked about drift and how you can add sort of this analog tonality to your oscillators. But that's turned up to 100% on both of those. And if you want to see the exact volumes here, oscillator 1, just volumes maxed up at 0 dB. Oscillator 2, as I said, is about -7.5. And then the volume up here is just full on 0 decibels. Both of these, I believe, only have one voice. Yeah, so there's no like unison detuning, multiple voices on the same oscillator or anything like that. Both oscillators are passing through filter 1. We're only using filter 1 here. I'm using this EMS DCS3 filter. It just had some nice bite to it when I started modulating it. You can see I have the cutoff control. This is important. This is sort of like the cutoff and resonance control for both filters. I don't really like to use that, so I have both of those turned down all the way. So purely we're using the cutoff and the resonance dials here to control the filter. You can see the cutoff is all the way down, 20 hertz. The resonance is up just a tiny bit, 1.03. The envelope, it's at 0 right now, but we actually are going to be using this envelope parameter with one of our macros, as I'll explain in a moment here. And the drive is all the way down. I know a lot of people, when filters have a drive control on them, they automatically just want to bump this sucker up. Yeah, drive, bro. But it was actually making things a little too more gritty than I wanted it to be. I kind of like the subtle tonality with the drive all the way down. So I left that all the way down. Again, feel free to experiment with it. You can make your own iteration of this patch if you want to. Now, the important thing here is the envelopes and the velocity settings and the macros. So that's where we'll get a little bit more in detail here. So let's take a quick look at these envelopes. The amp envelope we'll start with. This is a very fast attack. I just increased the attack a tiny bit to prevent any clicking or popping at the beginning of the notes. Release is at this kind of, it looks like a medium level, but it's still pretty fast, but it's 0.8 seconds, 0.87 seconds. This is kind of important too. I've dropped the sustain level to -4.32. Somewhere thereabouts is fine. You don't have to be exact with these numbers. Just get it close. And then the decay time is 2,978 milliseconds, about 3 seconds, almost 3 seconds. So that's not a really drastic thing, but it is just giving us the illusion of the bass starting off really loud and then just dipping in volume a little bit as the notes are sustained, as the notes are held down. Now, this is important, this velocity parameter. If this is at 12 o'clock, it's not doing anything. I have it up at a value of 20%. That means that higher velocities will increase the volume slightly, lower velocities will decrease the volume slightly. I've done the same thing over here. It's at about 20% on this filter envelope. Now, the filter envelope is moving the filter cutoff, right? So here the envelope's a little bit different. I have a very fast attack. I have a short decay, 415 milliseconds. Very low sustain, -14.64, and then the release time is close to the release time here. This is what, 0.7 seconds, 7.5. This is 0.87, so they're very close. Now, normally you would engage this filter envelope. Basically, you would tell this filter envelope to move the cutoff by turning this envelope parameter up. Right now, the envelope parameter is at 0. But I have a macro that's actually doing that for me. So I've mapped this envelope dial to macro number 4. You can see it's called filter ENV for filter envelope, because we're going to be automating this throughout the track. So I want to just easy access. So all the parameters I wanted to automate, I've mapped to macros. So how do we map things to macros if I've never done this before in Anna 2? Well, it's pretty simple. All I have to do is right click on the dial, and then I can select from the bottom part of this list here one of my macros. So I selected macro 4, and this is just mapped 1-to-1 to macro 4, meaning if this is all the way down, this is at 0 at 12 o'clock, and if this is back up where I had it at a value of 54.33. That means that I've increased this by about 54%. So it's probably like up here around the halfway point somewhere, okay? Now, if we turn this macro down, now the filter cutoff is not moving at all. It's just sitting all the way down. We barely hear the sound, right? So we need to make sure that that's open at least a little bit. If we click on the mod tab, we can see a list of my macro mappings here. So I've got the, again, macro 4 is controlling that filter 1 envelope dial. Let's just go through the macros really quickly. Macro 1, you can see, is controlling the releases and the decays of both of my envelopes. So this decay, this release, this decay, this release. If I turn that macro up, it makes the notes really long. So that's something we'll use in builds and in different sections of the song to add some tension. I've also got a sustain macro, that's macro number 2. And that's mapped to the sustains on both of the envelopes. So that will keep the sound more open without it dropping off, the decays, lowering it. Have that very low. And then macro 3, I believe, is just mapped to the cutoff. Yeah, filter 1's frequency. So this is set, again, the cutoff up here is all the way down. This is mapped to macro 3. Macro 3's got it coming up to about 31%. If I do that, I'm opening the filter up. If I do this, I'm closing the filter down. So this is kind of controlling the starting point of the cutoff. This, I like to think, is controlling the peak point of the cutoff. So it's kind of peaking louder before it dips back down, whereas this is causing it to start at a higher value or start at a lower value. Again, if it's too low, we barely hear the sound, so we want to kind of use caution when setting this. Last thing I'll mention about the filter envelope, I guess 2 things about the filter envelope. One, I've changed the slope or the envelope preset here to Anna 2. These, I don't know the exact differences between all of these, but these will just adjust how the slopes of the attack time and the release time kind of ramp up and ramp down. If you've ever used Serum, for example, X for Record Serum, it's a very popular synthesizer. You can adjust the sloping of your attack time, for example. These will all be different, and then this curve control will slope them in different ways. So this was kind of important. I sort of messed around with this. What do I have it at? -40%. If this is all the way down, you can see even without changing any of my times or my macros, the sound is quite different. Hear how it gets kind of sharper? It's almost more staccato the more I increase this. So that could potentially be something cool to map to a macro, but I was playing around with this and I found that 40% sounded good, or roughly 41% sounded good to me. I didn't touch that on the amp envelope. I think that defaults to 50%, so I just kind of left it right there. And then the last couple things here are the processing. Let's just go quickly because I don't want this video to go too long. But I did use the EQ, and believe it or not, this might seem counterintuitive, but I actually used a low shelf on the EQ. We've got this low shelf at about 98 hertz, and I've just pulled the gain down quite a bit. The reason for that is because I noticed in the reference song, the bass is not super subby. The bass is a lot more tonal, and it's got more like mid-range harmonics that kind of cut through the mix, low mids, things like that, but it's not really that subby. The kick drum is handling more of the low subby frequencies in the track, so I've just shelved down the lows a little bit. And then in terms of processing, I've added this tube drive. You can find that under distortion here. I've got the dry wet at 100%. I've turned this drive parameter all the way down, and I've adjusted the tone. Feel free to play around with these settings. I didn't have a rhyme or reason for doing what I did. I just kind of, wiggled the dials around, and these settings kind of sounded good. The tube model as the AU7 sounded nice to me. The tone increased up to 55%, sounded good too. It could sound quite different depending on where you set these things. That was giving me a little too much buzz. I didn't really want that. Then after that, we have just the tiniest bit of hall reverb. Now remember, these are going in series here, one after the other. So we start with the tube drive, the distortion, then we go to the reverb. This is using the hall reverb, and I've got the dry wet is at 7%. So just the tiniest bit of that to add a little space to the sound. The size is relatively small. Decay is 0.13 seconds. So just, a few milliseconds here. Really, really short. We don't want this big, obvious reverb on this. Just a little touch of spaciousness. And then lastly, and this is pretty important, I use this multi-limiter effect. So this is kind of like a multiband limiter. I use this mostly to bring the highs and the mids out a little bit more. So I adjusted the threshold levels. I brought the actual output level of the highs up to 4 decibels. The mids I brought Looks like I brought that down. I don't know if I meant to do that though. It's just a tiny bit below 0. And the lows are a little up. I brought the lows up to 1. I probably didn't need to do that because then I ended up EQing those down anyway. But the main thing here was bringing the threshold down on the mids and the highs, and then bringing the output volume up on the highs, just to bring some of that high harmonic grit out a little bit more in the sound. Also emphasizes a little bit of the distortion here. So if you have like if you're using Ableton, of course, you probably are if you're following along with this, you could use the multiband dynamics effect if you don't have an if you don't have ANA 2. You could use an EQ8 and just like kind of EQ some of these frequencies up if you want to, or if your synth has a built-in EQ like this, we could push some of the mids and some of the highs up. I didn't end up doing that though. In fact, let me redo this. I don't want to mess these settings up here. But yeah, I use the multiband limiter just as kind of like a different way to get a mid and high boost to the sound. Let's set this one to 0 as well. Okay, cool. And really just the EQ is shelving down some of the lows. So that's pretty much it. I guess it's worth mentioning I have the mono switch turned on the bass as well, so it's just monophonic. It can't play more than one note at a time. There's no portamento or anything, no slide. But that's pretty much the bass patch. Probably this video went on longer than I needed it to. And guess what? We got a whole second video on the bass, because next what I want to show you is how I've utilized these macros and utilized a rack in Ableton to use what are called macro variations and create all these different ways that the bass plays throughout the track. So stick around, we'll look at that next.
Music. Musical. Music. Musical. Music. Musical.